Good evening, everyone. My name is Nick Rothwell, and I'm the General Manager for Merneke in the UK and Ireland, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our Time to Act on SSI webinar this evening. Despite clear evidence and guidelines, including those from the World Health Organization and the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, surgical site infections in the UK still remain high. It's critical that we understand why this is the case and what measures might support us to prevent more of these infections. In order to do this, Merneke recently published the report Time to Act, a State of the Nation report on surgical site infections, which looks at the scale of the challenges of tackling SSIs in the UK. We spoke as a company to a number of leading clinicians, including Professor Mike Reed, a consultant trauma and orthopedic surgeon, Lindsay Keeley, the patient safety and quality lead at the Association for Perioperative Practice, and many others. The valuable insight we gained from them enabled us to understand the impact of SSIs on the NHS and patients firsthand, and assess what more can be done to prevent these infections from happening in the first place. I'm pleased to share that they have joined us for this evening's webinar, providing us with all of this valuable insight, along with Anna Thompson, who is the SSI Surveillance Lead at Ashford and St Peter's NHS Trust, and also Helen Hughes from Patient Safety Learning, who is going to be joining us shortly. So I'd now like to introduce Dr. Steve Feast, former CEO of the Eastern Academic Health Science Service Network, who will be chairing this evening's webinar. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much, everyone who's joined us. This is really a timely moment, isn't it? The need for the NHS to be as efficient and effective as possible to maintain patient trust and confidence in the services we offer, and assure that every time we think about operating on a patient, we're also thinking about how safe and confident we can be in their journey and how much the patients, the clinicians, and others can help us get the best possible outcome for them. And of course, COVID-19 has thrown into real focus the need for the whole service, from policy through to the work of hospitals and the work that boards do, through to the clinical teams that are operating in patients, through to patients themselves and patient advocacy groups, how we can remobilize how we approach care in order to radically transform and achieve different outcomes. So COVID-19 is something to learn from. But it's also been a time at which the way we use our operating theatres, the way we deploy staff, the training we can offer staff has become very fragmented. People are working in very different places. Operating theatres are often now being used in intensive care units. And during the drafting and writing of this report, we interviewed a whole number of clinicians from different professional backgrounds who were really clear that what they're trained to do and the skills that they've learned over the last few years were not necessarily being applied or used as efficiently as they could be in their day-to-day actions. So to see a company like Merneke working with practitioners, working with patients to actually assemble not just the expertise that we've got on this call, but the evidence across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, the evidence from across the world, and the evidence that we've got in the GIRFT and wider programs, the QUIS programs, alongside Public Health England, the World Health Organization, into a series of recommendations, I think is more than welcome, more than timely, and is, I hope, a template that we can use as we rebuild back into the efficient and effective service that we all know that patients should be receiving. So tonight we're going to start with the perspective of the patient and patient advocacy, always the right starting point for any actions and any consideration as to how we can get the best possible outcomes. We have practitioners from both the expert groups that are working, perioperative care practitioners, and also practitioners with us who are working in a hospital, trying to get the end-to-end treatment that is actually about working not just with the board, but working with the quality, safety, and wider groups across an organization, and sharing that expertise to know how that can be built and put together. And also, we take a perspective from Mike as well, in terms of the wider operative leadership that the QUIS group has been given and how that's been working with GIRFT. Now, this is your seminar, so for all of you that have joined, we've got some questions for the speakers, and which you'll hear each of them speak and to present their slides. But the most important thing is actually for you to field some questions too, that the team in the background will synthesize, and then through me, I can try and get a wider conversation going. They make it more interesting, more contemporary for all of you who I hope have read the report. If not, I commend it to you. And we can then really get going into terms of what does it mean over the next 6 or 12 months. But one thing it definitely will mean is what's called a letter to editor. And a letter to editor is where, based on the evidence, based on the experience of experts, a letter is sent using national press, using trade press or specialist press, that says actually we can't stand still. That we as a collective practice feel very strongly that something needs to change. That what is fragmented should become unified. What is patchwork should become a whole, and the data that's used and the evidence that we can collect together builds up an overall picture that requires action. So at the end of this webinar, you'll be invited to, through a link, not during the webinar itself, to contribute to that letter to editor and to become a co-signatory in order to increase the impact, and then from that, improve the quality and outcomes for the patient that we serve as we go about our day-to-day business. So I hope you're on board with us. I hope that's set focus for all of us. And thank you very much. In particular, Helen, I see you've joined us on the screen as well, so welcome. And we'll check your volume and stuff as we go through. And really, well, Helen, you're first up. So from a patient perspective, the impact of unsafe care and how to improve safety.
Hello, thank you. I think I turned my mic, not only turned my mic on, but I managed to turn my visual off. So the first idiot webinar star goes to me. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks, Steve, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this really important session and to celebrate a really excellent report. I thought this was very, very good work. If Rob's going to do the slides for me, so next slides. Yeah, so what I've been asked to do is just to say a little bit about who we are, patient safety learning, the impact that surgical site infections has on patients and the action that we think is needed, and how that learning needs to be shared and how we can collaborate. So I will try to keep to my 8 minutes, but Steve, if you think I'm going over long, do haul me back. I get very enthusiastic. So next slide, please. So the scale of unsafe care, it is alarming. And when you think about the scale of COVID deaths in the US being 400,000, which is a grim and stark reminder of the world we live in the US, they suffer 250,000 avoidable deaths annually from what they describe as medical errors. So unsafe care, sadly, is a feature of healthcare systems globally. And I've got some statistics there, which I'm not going to read out, but it does show that patient safety issues are one of the top 10 leading causes of death and disability in the world. And that's shocking. It's shocking for the impact it has on patients. It's shocking the cost of it. So 15% of costs of healthcare are attributable to unsafe care. So if we could do the right thing for patients and for staff, then we would save money for doing better healthcare. And we know from the NHS's work in the UK, we're looking at about 11,000 avoidable deaths a year. So it's a significant challenge. Next slide. So I'll tell you a little bit more about patient safety learning, but we've been reflecting since we started as a charity 3 years ago. Why is harm a persistent problem? What is it that we need to fix? And part of that is the idea that safety is one priority of many and needs to be much more of a core purpose of a healthcare system. There are a few standards that guide us. We don't really design safe systems in the way that other industries do. And sadly, a lot of our healthcare workers work in cultures of blame and fear that don't actively encourage speaking up or highlighting error, or indeed providing opportunities for improvement. We strongly believe that patients have a very significant role. There's a lot of evidence-based, research evidence-based, that patients not being engaged in healthcare provision at the point of care means that their lack of engagement doesn't diminish the opportunity for unsafe care and avoidable harm. And we think there's a real leadership failure. I think that's you've probably not been quite as stark in the language, but the report, the Time to Act report, does talk about lack of leadership, leadership at a kind of policy level, at a government level, at a NHS executive leadership level, and that I think is at one of at the core of why we're not attending to these issues in the way that we should. And even when we know we have knowledge, we fail to learn and act on that knowledge. Next slide. Thank you. So what do we need to do? Well, we think we need to do the opposite of that. We need to think a little differently, and we need to start putting safety at the core purpose of what we do. And I think we would say that the Time to Act report reflects in detail for surgical site infections some of these sort of system design issues that we've described, that you can see there. The importance of having that leadership, having standards, having safety comparison data, making sure that staff are competent and able to deliver safe care, that you're designing in patient safety and human factors expertise in a culture where patients and staff are engaged to learn and to act on that learning. Next slide. So who are we? Well, we're a small charity. We've issued a report that describes this in more detail, which would be very welcome for you to read. And it's called A Blueprint for Action, because I think a strong theme for today is taking the knowledge of why harm persists and what more we need to do and apply that for action for improvement. So that's our report, A Blueprint for Action. And we talk about these 6 foundations, 7 of which are there, of what we need to address at an organisation level. But very importantly, what we do is we amplify the voice of the front line, that's staff, patients, families, and call for more action, more resources. And indeed, some of those organisational standards and accreditation for patient safety is something that we're actively developing with a number of partners, which we can talk about at another time, but just to give you a heads up on some of that quite exciting work that we're doing. Next slide. I'm not going to go through the SSIs, the frequency and the guidance. I think Lindsay will go through that in more detail, but just to reinforce, it's the second most frequent type of hospital-acquired infection in Europe. It's an enormous problem. Next slide. And I've phrased it as a devastating impact hidden in plain sight. We know so much about this. We know the scale of infections, the impact on excess morbidity and mortality. 5% of patients contract an SSI in NHS. A third of deaths in patients with SSIs are directly attributable to that infection. And shockingly, 60% of those are preventable. Now, patients don't necessarily know this. They may be aware when it happens to them of increased pain. There will be social disruption. They may have a longer time in hospitals. It means they're less able to get up and about. It may be that they're severely disabled for life. It may be that they're not as economically active. Maybe other people will have to care for them and their families while they recover. So there are huge sort of social and economic impact, not as well as the health impact. And so I would also, a phrase that we're beginning to understand more about is second harm, where a patient is injured by the healthcare system. If the healthcare system doesn't respond, then the patient and their families are doubly harmed because they're not believed, or they're not treated, or they're not supported. They're left isolated, frustrated, and probably quite shocked that these statistics that I've just read out are well known, and that there's a huge variability in activity and performance across different organisations, and they don't know that. I think would be a theme. I put there a little about the prevalence and economic impact, because it's huge. The cost of these of doing the wrong thing is very expensive, and it doubly there's an economic business case reason for action as well. Next slide. So there's a lot of resource here, and I've put the next two slides from my colleagues. I used to work at the World Health Organization, a part of setting up the patient safety team there, working with Leon Donaldson. And these slides come from Dr. Benedetta Allegranzi, who is the WHO lead on hospital-acquired infections, including safe surgery infections. And I worked with her as part of that team, and I know the quality of resource that is developed and is available for people to use. And I think the emphasis on that slide that's been highlighted by Benedetta is the importance of SSI prevention throughout the surgical patient journey. So always having the patient focus and following the patient through it. Next slide. And this builds on the work. I was at WHO when the first global challenge on hospital-acquired infection around high hand hygiene was developed. And what was really effective in that program was this kind of what was called a multimodal strategy. So looking at, and I think the Time to Act report reflects on these themes about needing system change, needing training and education, evaluation and feedback, communication, awareness raising, and having the right cultural tools within the organisation. Next slide. So what we see in patient safety learning, in some areas we don't have sufficient knowledge. In many other areas, like with surgical site infections, what we have is a no-do gap. We have knowledge, but we don't apply that knowledge, and we don't always apply it in a consistent way. So the report, and I would imagine other colleagues will emphasize this in their presentations, but even with that knowledge, the reduction in SSI rates since 2014 is 0.1%. I mean, that's pretty feeble, really, and it explains why greater emphasis is needed. There isn't a UK-wide government strategy, and the national bodies don't have targets for this reduction. And there are so many different ways of monitoring incidents that it's very, very difficult to get that evaluation of feedback and the accountability that I think patients and patient advocates would look for. If some organisations can do it, why not all? Next slide. And some of that, reinforcing the WHO perspective, the importance of organisational culture change in this, the leadership and grabbing this as an issue. So having technically excellent information and resources just shared with clinicians isn't going to be sufficient. It does need an organisational leadership and organisational cultural change. Next slide. And so the call for action. Well, the report makes some very, very good recommendations. And I haven't repeated them here because there are some that are for government, some for policy, some for patients, some for clinicians. But I think what I'd like to emphasize is that first point about this needs strategic leadership throughout the system. We need to address variation in performance. And the area I'd like to just reflect on a little bit is around patient engagement. What is the patient's role, both as a participant and someone that's receiving care, someone that is at risk, and potentially their role in awareness raising and advocacy. So I think public reporting, transparent reporting of rates of surgical site infections, goals by organisation, and impact of initiatives, that needs to be much more transparent. And I think that's because, as well as patients being patients, they're also citizens, and in the NHS we've got a publicly funded system, so there's an accountability framework there that we need to reinforce. I think an area, I'm not sure that it was reflected on in the report, but it's one that we're seeing more patient groups being interested in, is about informed consent. When patients are being consented for surgery, of course, that's the main focus of the discussion with the clinicians, but are they consenting to the level of risk that relates to them around surgical site infections? I know if myself and my family were offered an opportunity for surgery in one organisation that had maybe 4 times rate of surgical site infections than another, I may choose to make a different decision around consent. But I think patients aren't given that information, and that is something that if we were turning SSI reductions into a bit of a social movement, that would be an area that would be worth thinking about, the patient advocacy role.
Helen, time is accelerating past us.
Yes, okay. So So some of that is patient in their own care, but as an advocate. And then in terms of shared learning, I think Lindsay will talk a little bit more about this, about how to share best practice. But I will ask Rob to do the next slide, please. And just reflect on Sir Liam Nondelson's statement, which is very, very powerful, even 20 years after he said it, with organisation with a memory. So to err is human, to cover up is unforgivable, and fail to learn is inexcusable. So where we have knowledge of where things go wrong, knowledge of good practice, why aren't we learning and applying that? So one of the things that we're doing in patient safety learning is we've developed and delivered a knowledge sharing platform for patient safety. And if you go on to the next slide, Rob, then this is an online platform for patient safety. This is a screenshot from today, and you'll see on the right-hand side, we've promoted Time to Act on surgical site infections as a promotion today. It's a free repository that's designed for the benefit of clinicians, researchers, academics, patients, anyone and everyone, free to use, free to register. And if you go on to the next slide, please, Rob. You'll see that in just over a year, we've had now nearly 300,000 page views, something like about 60–70% of all NHS organisations have members in it. We've had visitors from 174 countries, and we increasingly put lots of resources. So we've been designing, partly because of today's webinar, but putting more and more content about surgical site infections on our repository so that everyone can easily access it. Next slide. And we just invite you to join that community, become a topic expert, share your knowledge, and help promote specifically the very, very good report and the recommendations in Time to Act. And I will, for one, most definitely be signing up as the letter to the editor.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Very welcome.
And so for those on the call, a lot of these resources should come up on the offers button. Either now or will be shared later. So we'll be sharing the links across. Helen, I just want to ask you one question at this stage before I come to Lindsay. Recommendation 1 is to convene a preventable infections task force. And what do you think is the role of the patient and the expertise that you've got in that task force?
Well, I think if you look at something like the global program, the global challenges that WHO did, they had a similar kind of task force where they brought the great and the good. And I think what was very important in those, that the first one on hand hygiene, second one that produced the safe surgery checklist, it's very, very important to have the patient there, or patient representatives, because they have a particular perspective that might be new, might be novel, might be slightly different to the clinician. They're looking at it from their own perspective, and that would be an omission not to have the patient perspective in as participant and knowledge in their own care. But they can be incredibly powerful as a leverage for change, as advocacy, as campaigning. Now, SSI doesn't have, to my knowledge, patient Facebook groups. There isn't a charity for SSIs that is patient facing. So I think that's something, it would be very good to create that interest, that dynamism, to get the patient experience to inform. Jeremy Hunt, when he presented to a meeting in Geneva last February when we were developing the WHO program, his advice to the 70 experts in the room from around the world was, engage your patient communities and engage the media, because they will make your politicians listen. You may try and argue as a clinician, but they may not listen. But if their constituencies are concerned about it, they will. So I think there's a patient perspective and advocacy.
So we'll come back to maybe some questions as to how patients are best represented, whether that's individual experience or through the patient advocacy organisations, in the questions later. So let's hold that. Lindsay, there's 2 tasks for you. The first really is the Association for Perioperative Care Practitioners, why you engage with Monica on this report. So we'll start with that before you go into your slides, because I guess for you, this has been a great opportunity for your own constituency and practitioners to engage with the evidence and to share your day-to-day experience. So what's been great about you and working on this report with Monica itself? You're on mute at the moment.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Sorry, there was a problem there. Okay. Basically, APP works collaboratively, and surgical site infection is key to everything that palliative practitioners do in practice. We are the people that can initially start a surgical site infection. So everything that we do, from hair removal to surgical skin prep, and we are constantly working with organisations with regards to the prevention of surgical infection, how to create and improve best practice and guidelines, and also to have these sort of recognised nationally across the UK rather than in a local policy or in a local organisation, which sometimes we find this is happening, which is why maybe we're not getting the percentages that we need in reducing surgical site infection.
So through the report, you've managed to kind of bring to the attention of a much wider constituency and group of people the experiences of those practitioners that you work with more closely.
We normally, through our website and through our webinars and also various documentations and publications that we put out there, we are actually raising the profile of the incidence of surgical site infection, the need to look at this. We have also produced a revised documentation of the infection control section of the APP standards and recommendation, and this was during COVID. So I think a lot of us really need to think about what we were doing before COVID. What was our standards then? Were they where they need to be, which I don't think they were. I think COVID made us realise this, which is why we had various people not understanding how to cope and deal with COVID. And I think we're now at a point where we're understanding how to prevent cross-infection and to reduce it. But equally, I think there's a need for policies to be introduced, and the education around that and the knowledge, in order for us to embed that into practice.
Okay. Well, let's take your first slide then, Lindsay.
Okay. So first of all, obviously welcome everybody to this webinar on surgical site infection. I wanted to basically explore how APP works collaboratively, what we produce, and how we can actually improve practice. So rather than putting a lot of information on the slides, I wanted to go through each section so that I've actually put on the slides and actually explain further what APP does and how we improve surgical site infection. So standards and recommendations. So APP have worked and continue to work professionals, organisations to provide resources to be used in a structured framework, which we provide to assess compliance and guidance, ensuring healthcare professionals are aware of how to apply infection prevention through best practice, which is through our best practice guidelines that we provide, and how we can hopefully apply infection prevention in practice in the perioperative environment across the surgical pathways to reduce surgical site infection. In resuming elective surgery, as we know, post-COVID, we started in March and we went into July, where we were actually starting to see some elective surgery come back. But in reality, I think we all knew the writing was on the wall and that COVID wasn't going away. So we're now in a situation where obviously a lot of places are not actually doing a lot of elective surgery, and some have actually stopped elective surgery. So APB provided some guidance around this to help people initially at the time, because people just didn't know where to go, along with lots of other organisations, such as the Royal College of Surgeons, which is why APP continues to work collaboratively across all organisations and professional bodies, hopefully to provide the best-based guidance for people to look at their current practice and patient safety. So APP provides evidence-based guidance, as I said, which is standards and recommendations to enhance the palliative practitioner's knowledge on preventing surgical site infections. When I look at my own practice, skin preparation was one which is very significant, we know has changed. So from obviously shaving and removing body hair, we've now gone to the point where we actually are encouraged not to actually remove body hair, because we know this is a potential risk for surgical site infection, and wherever possible, either we don't remove it or we remove only the amount that we need, particularly in the area where the surgical incision is actually being placed. Practitioners' knowledge around this and understanding of this is not across the board. So by providing information through the standards and recommendations, we're able to inform practitioners and also advise them regarding their practice. All the evidence that we give is researched and evidence-based, and also can be reviewed by the practitioner in order to either challenge current practice and improve patient safety within their own organisations. AFPP also, as I said, works collaboratively with experts across various bodies. We work with NICE, Infection Prevention Society, Health Protection Agencies, Public Health England, and the Department of Health. We look at all aspects, and that's just a few, regarding how to advise practitioners about best practice locally. Through this Monoliki roundtable event, obviously we have realised and are aware acutely of what is happening out there with regards to surgical site infections, what actually is available for practitioners and what the evidence is there available in order to support us in reducing surgical site infection. With regards to the multidisciplinary team approach, we have often really struggled with this in practice, and there is various hierarchical issues that we've had within the operating theatre. This has obviously improved over years, but I think it's a need to recognise that when you talk about the multidisciplinary team, this starts when the patient actually is at pre-assessment and is going through their pathway, whether it's an integrated pathway or a speciality specific pathway for a procedure. Everything that happens to that patient, their journey, all the information should be in that pathway and should be able to guide us. But we often feel that we can't speak to people, or we often have really bad communication in able to talk to different people at different levels. You've probably found through the WHO 5 steps to safer surgery, the team brief and the debrief, and everybody being able to have a voice. This has obviously overcome some of the hierarchical issues that some organisations do still have, but it's about everybody understanding that no matter who you are, what level you are at, you all have a voice, and it's about this team approach, and equally everybody is able to state if they have got a concern or an issue at that stage. With regards to your multidisciplinary team approach, I've often found that the environment is quite difficult to ensure that evidence is incorporated. And again, this is about how the evidence is gathered, how it's disseminated, who actually communicates it, and whether it's being able to embed in practice. You'll find that with best practice across the surgical pathways, this often lacks because of the lack of this multidisciplinary team approach, which seems to be rather sort of vague in different areas. Also, with regards to infection prevention, AFPP works collaboratively, as I've stated, with lots of different organisations and partners in interest. I think often people think that companies do not seem to have the knowledge or the expertise in order to provide you with this information. Having worked and networked across these sort of parameters, I would agree that a lot of the experts that are within these organisations are studying at a high level and are able to have this information to provide us with best practice in regarding to how we prevent surgical site infections. In order to provide educational knowledge and material, this also, the infection prevention information that we provide, has also helped to improve practice locally and also nationally. We've worked collaboratively to provide various resources, tools and things which have also helped within organisations to reduce this. Wound contamination obviously is paramount, and asepsis, and how we actually maintain asepsis within practice and within the theatre environment. You often find that, and I have found in lots of areas, is sometimes it's a bit like driving. When we've been driving for years, we can get complacent and we don't actually reflect on our practice and what we're actually doing and the implications of what we're actually doing, not only to ourselves but to the patient, and ultimately would this lead to a surgical site infection. I also found that as a practitioner, often I wasn't informed unless it was directly as a result of a procedure that I've been involved in, whether a patient later on down the line had acquired a surgical site infection. This wasn't something that wasn't disseminated to the people that are actually working on the floor. Often managers and senior management would know about this, but it was about everybody in the theatre environment knowing potentially that they had an issue with surgical site infection, and obviously their practice needed to be looked at or audited.
Great, thank you.
With regards to local policies, I found that often with local policies, people don't use them correctly. So when COVID first started, people actually didn't realise from an infection control point of view that they did have a policy in the first place. And if obviously some places didn't have a policy, there was a need for one. They didn't go back to looking at whatever policies they had before they thought about surgical site infection prevention, PPE and COVID in general. And we found we were actually directing people initially back to what they already had, and then looking at the COVID aspects of this in order to support people in their practice. They also, you would find as a practitioner, when you talk about policies, many people say, oh, we've got various policies, they're on the S drive or they're in a folder or something, and nobody ever reads them, which is why this information isn't disseminated to the people that are actually working in the environment that need to understand it, and which is why it's not embedded in practice. The policy is there to aid and support you in practice, and obviously guidance and something that you have to follow locally. This does not mean that you cannot change or challenge a policy if you have got research and evidence base to do that otherwise, which is something that people don't realise they're able to do. It's also knowing that there's a consistency needed in regards to embedding this into practice. You often find that the need to develop local policies has been more evident since COVID-19 has happened than at any other time regarding particularly PPE and obviously the implications of aerosol generated procedures and the potentials of infection.
Lindsay, I'm going to stop you there.
Yes.
Because I think the national evidence-based guidelines we can deal with in the wider discussion. I wanted to ask you a question, if I may, before we move on to the next speaker, which is the Association of Periodic Practice, I guess, has been quite an anchor for a lot of people during this chaotic time, and you've learned how to communicate with people and how to keep the community going. Looking ahead, what do you think your main role is in terms of sharing the standards, the collaborative practice, as we start rebuilding surgical practice?
I think initially, we need to know, are we able to start elective surgery and how we do that? I think we need to go back to our standard precautions and policies that we already have. And I think the problem they're going to have initially is, if you think about it, a lot of the people are going to be exhausted and stressed. They're being redeployed. There might be some sort of difference with regards to, have the policies have changed and how to educate people. So education is key in order for people to understand what they need to know in regards to infection control post-COVID and how they're going to deal with it. The only thing that has changed from an infection control point of view is the COVID aspect of regards to PPE, because I don't think people understood that when you look at the PPE that people are provided in practice. I used to go into operating theatres and I find 3 or 4 different boxes of surgical masks, and people just pick any one, not understand the meaning of it, when it's to be used, how it's to be used. And that's come across more evident because of COVID. And we have provided the correct information for people so that they're able to look at what they're actually doing in regards to practice and how to prevent risk both to themselves and the patient, which has been more so with the aerosol generated side of things with COVID.
Great, thank you. So it's a role for the for your members really to kind of go back to basics, relearn the rules, and make sure that we don't forget what we already know. I guess
I think that's what's happened. I think more so because the people are just sort of panicking. They went into panic mode.
Yeah.
And they didn't realise actually it's a bit like they didn't realise what they already had. They obviously weren't doing it correctly in the first place. The practice was not embedded to a level that would have allowed them to have coped with COVID. And also, I think sometimes they didn't use the infection control leads for the hospitals, and equally they were obviously being used even more. So they found that really difficult to actually put a policy in place so they knew exactly what they were doing.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, that rolls us nicely into you, Anna. From your own experience, obviously, at in St. Peter's with the GIRFT program and being at the centre of, what does it mean to actually organise this? Because I think you're a midwife, aren't you, by
registered nurse and midwife, yes.
Yeah, by training. So let's go into you, which is lessons from getting it right first time, best practice at Ashford and St. Peter's.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. With this presentation, I would just like to take you on the journey that we at Ashford and St. Peter's have been on since 2017. Although I wasn't part of the initial project, I only came into the project 2019. I would like just to tell you more about how we started our surgical site infection surveillance program at the Trust, where we are at the moment, and where we hope to be in about 3 to 4 years' time. Next slide, please, Rob. So we'll start with a little bit of background. In 2017, an audit was done on all the fracture neck of femur procedures that was done in the Trust for the SSI rate. This was led by Mr. Christopher Gee, who was then a registrar, but is now a consultant orthopedic surgeon in Glasgow. When they did the initial collection of data, in 2017, they realized that we had a really significant surgical site infection rate amongst these patients. A quality improvement project was started, and it was a multidisciplinary project that they started together with project management office and the quality department. It also involved the anesthetic department and various other ortho-geriatricians, the ward and theatres. Everybody was involved in this quality improvement project. The whole patient journey was reviewed, and at the end of 2017, they introduced the fracture neck of femur pathway, in which they had a look at all the care bundles as prescribed by NICE and have implemented them, which the probably most important at that time, where we had one of the biggest problems, was with patient warming, maintaining homeostasis. So after the project, after they've implemented the new pathway, the results showed that for 257 days, the Trust had no SSIs reported for any neck of femur surgeries. So they had, for 198 consecutive procedures, only a 0.3% rate of infection, which was a very, very significant improvement. The mortality rate went from 7% to 4%. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, like everything in life, when you don't keep your eye on the ball drops to the floor. So they have done a fantastic amount of work, and that triggered the Trust to realize that if we had a problem with fracture neck of femurs, maybe somewhere else we have a problem as well. And management under Dr. Fluck and our chief executive, Suzanne Rankin, decided to look further into this and have enrolled us in 2019 to take part of the GIRFT study. So unfortunately, fracture neck of femur rate increased again. We started collecting data in May of 2019, and it was all led by Mr. Sashi Irukula. He is the director for surgery, theatres and anesthesia, and also a consultant bariatric surgeon. The PM project management office was included in this, and in August of 2019, I got the post as the lead surgical site infection surveillance nurse to start up the program with Mr. Irukula. I was in theatres at Ashford and St. Peter's, orthopedic scrub nurse. So I had a little bit of background in knowing maybe where we had a problem and where to look for. So we completed GIRFT in December of 2019, and we received our data pack in March of 2020. We recognized that we need to improve in many areas. Next slide, please, Rob. So I have Dr. Fluck's consent to use our data, and we would like to share it with you because we really, really hope that in a year's time we would show you completely different figures than this. So as you can see from our GIRFT data, we were above average and above national average in every single procedure that we submitted. Next slide, please, Rob. So very, very important is that we have the complete backing of the management of our trust to sort this problem. We know we have a lot of room for improvement, and it just makes everything much easier for us when we know we have backing and we have the understanding that we need to improve our service. So because I was new to this area and it's a new project for the hospital, a program, I visited other hospital trusts that was already established in surgical site surveillance. I went to Guy's and St. Thomas, where I met the SSI expert Lillian Juera, and also to St. Richard's in Chichester, where I met Kari, because they are more or less the same size hospital than us. Obviously, Guy's and St. Thomas is much bigger. And I really found that it was really, really important to work collaboratively with other people in your area to find out how they are working, what things made it work for them and what things made it difficult for them. You can tailor everything according to your needs, but just have that insight of what has worked previously for other trusts. Then we started to audit all the nice care bundles to prevent surgical site infections, and we went to have a look to see whether they are already implemented in the trust and where they weren't. So we had multidisciplinary team discussions to discuss which of the care bundles that's not implemented we were going to implement first. We identified areas that needed implementation of the care bundles first, and then we implemented projects. So the implementation of the projects is really an ongoing process for us. We've already had 26 projects and that ranged from the implementation of easy warm blanket for all pre-op patients, right through to antibiotic protocol, prophylactic protocols for each specialty and specific procedures. The aim is for us is to standardize care across our whole trust. Because we have 2 sites and we have 3 theatre complexes, it is quite difficult to make sure that everybody is using the same equipment and every patient gets the same treatment from start to finish. So that is essentially very, very important for us to make sure that we standardize everything across the trust. In setting up a program, in the beginning, because it was I was the only lead nurse, and we have a big trust, and there's a lot of places, departments, and a lot of people to see. So it was really, really important for me to form partnerships with anybody that could help me. Lillian Juera from Guy's and St. Thomas, obviously expert, so she gave me a lot of time in explaining things I didn't understand, guiding me through processes, advising. I used the clinical educators from all the products that we were using to do training for us, because quite early on I realized that it is due to a lack of understanding and knowledge that we missed a lot of gaps, that we had a lot of gaps to fill. And when you know better, you will do better. So training and education was very early on identified as one of our most important factors to focus on. And going into partnerships where they can come in and do your training for you takes the pressure off me, and I could focus my attention either on data collection or planning of the next project. We also ran a lot of awareness campaigns in the hospital last year. We did expos where we had displays of all the equipment used. Patients could come and ask questions. We have talks with them and explain to them what surgical site surveillance is. Also staff, and we had quite a big success with that, with getting out the program. Next slide, please, Rob.
How many more slides have we got, Anna? Because we just pushed for time.
You can skip 2 slides, please, Rob. That's fine. So the biggest challenges we have in the beginning in any program is your buy-in. Is to get everybody to understand what is surgical site infection, what you expect of them, and where you are going with that. Communication is of utmost importance. You need to communicate with everybody and anybody as you can. Staff turnaround was a big problem as well, as it is in every trust in the country. So that therefore, continuous education the whole year through is very, very important. Financial investment, we really had good backing from our trust. We've not had a problem with that, but it is just because they realize that if they invest now, it will save us loads of money later in the future. Data collection in the beginning is it's difficult because it's labor intensive. So we are starting small with a few procedures, and then we will build up the more people we have. We have a collaborative surgical site oversight committee at the moment that is led by Mr. Irukula. Ahmed Watt is also our vice chair of that, and he was involved in the WHO safety patient checklist. So we are really privileged to have a lot of people on the oversight committee that is really insightful and has extreme expertise in the different fields. We have a lead surgeon consultant for every speciality, as well as representation from the matrons of theatres and all the surgical wards, antibiotic stewards, and also microbiology. COVID was a big challenge for us. It stopped the work completely, and we had to pick up the pieces and start over again. Next slide, please. So for our future, we hope to reach within the next 3 years is the data collection, continuous data collection that we are submitting to Public Health England. Currently, we are submitting continuous data for fracture neck of femurs, hip replacements, and knee replacements. We hope to add breast surgery from April, and from September we hope to add large bowel. That will give us robust baseline data throughout the year. Teaching and training program, we've got a year planned out in teaching and training consistently in all the theatres and wards throughout the year, every month. Speciality-specific SSI prevention pathway. So just like the neck of femur pathway that they implemented for specifically that procedure, we hope to implement that for all our specialities. And then we would like to raise the awareness and the profile of SSI prevention. We have a newsletter that's coming out now quarterly. We have a page on our trust intranet that people can go to and get more information or contact us, and we keep all our data on that as well, so we are transparent.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Great.
No, a patient information leaflet that we've just launched now as well.
Great. So just to remind everyone on the call that all of these slides, we skipped a couple of slides there, Anna, thank you. All these slides are available on the pane to the right of your screen for everyone. And also in terms of questions too, we've got a few questions. And I've actually got a theme I'm going to give you coming up. But the last section of this, after Mike's spoken, we will come back. And so if you're on this call, feel free to start putting some questions in. I'm watching them as they happen. I've got a team behind me as well. Anna, just one of the themes that's come out, and Lindsay, there's a lovely comment that the AFPP has been the go-to organisation to help us during COVID, providing us with the standards and information we need, which is great. But a theme that's coming out of the questions, Anna, is this sort of thing about, you know, the very many different people in the team, from the, you know, the perioperative practitioner, I guess, through to the porter, through to, you know, Clark. Through. How have you found getting all of those people together and helping them all feel valued in their role as part of getting this major problem improved?
With regards to, sorry.
Question for Anna. We'll come back to Lindsay in a bit. So
it is very, very important that you keep good communication lines with everybody. And it helps that you are sociable, if you are sociable and you can approach people. And it helps to ask questions. Always remember to speak to people to find out what are they doing, what are they thinking, do they have concerns? Usually when you find out about the problem, if you ask a question to certain members of staff 3 months ago, they would have told you. They know what's going on the floor, and if you just speak to people and listen, then it will make your job much easier.
Yeah. So in the GIRFT guidelines, is there a kind of checklist to say, you know, have you got all these people in the room, or have you made sure that you've thought about all the different people in the pathway? That there's so many different professional practitioners, aren't there, across a pathway?
Yeah. I don't think they specify who you have to have on your team, but when we had our meetings, we realized that if you look at the care bundles and you cover all your care bundles, then you will see what departments will put out at you. For instance, prophylactic antibiotic and protocols, you need your pharmacy and representative there with who is your antibiotic specialist, also your microbiologist that goes with that. You would definitely need your surgical matrons and your matrons to theatres involved, because they are the people that carry your message through to the people on the floor who is doing the work essentially. And then obviously every specialty needs a consultant in these meetings. They come and raise their concerns from their department, and they also take feedback back to their different departments. We also have very important, we have the quality improvement team on board.
Okay, and I'll stop you there. We'll perhaps come back in the questions as to how, you know, for the colleagues that are listening in, what is that kind of community? Something you mentioned about your board backing you with money. I guess a lot of people might be quite interested. How did you get the money out of the system? Well done. And the other one was something about these road shows as well. When we come into the wider questions, you know, the having all the equipment and doing some stuff. But Mike, that brings us to you. You've obviously been doing the quiz program and have quite a large, significant national profile in this area as well, as all the speakers do. And you won an HSJ Patient Safety Award, I think, in 2019 for your work as well. So over to you, Mike, and your perspective really from particularly the quiz program.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, I mean, one of the things that struck me really in the report, which is an excellent report actually, is around the cost of surgical site infection. And I mean that in a couple of ways. One is primarily for the patients. So, you know, in my business, I do joint replacements, and an infection in a joint replacement is a really significant risk to people's life. You know, the mortality rate is higher than it is with prostate cancer and breast cancer at 5 years. And it's a big problem for individual patients, and they will need to undergo multiple operations, have long stays in hospital, antibiotics. And, the cost to them is massive. Many of them will lose their jobs, lose their family relationships. And I think, what's been discussed tonight about engaging patients in this battle is really, really important. Because as far as I know, as you said, there is no single patient group advocating, which is, I think, an important gap that we've got. But also to comment on the cost of infections, which the financial cost, which is huge. So you know, a standard surgical site infection maybe costs £10,000. If you get an infected joint replacement and you need a revision of that or further surgery, you're looking at between £30,000 and £40,000. And the GIRFT report, the first GIRFT report, states about £100,000 for an infected joint replacement. So it's really big in terms of the economic drain on people as well. And you know, we have fairly severe consequences of infection in orthopedics, but this is a problem right across the whole of surgery. And you know, I reflect sometimes on the problems that patients must have in other specialties. So a vascular infection, for instance, if you've got an aortic graft that's infected, is really problematic. And I've seen patients with extracorporeal hearts, so really literally keeping their blood flowing, and if they get infected, there's a real problem. So this really scales right across the whole of surgery. So I'm going to talk now briefly about a collaborative we ran in the NHS over the last couple of years, and this is about reducing staphylococcal infection, which is probably the commonest, most aggressive type of surgical site infection. And I'm just going to talk about what we did. So this is Staph aureus and the little mushrooms here, and it's in biofilm, which makes it very difficult to get rid of. And that's really our public enemy number one in terms of surgical site infection, I would say. You have the MRSA version of this, which is rarer, thankfully, in the UK now, but there's also the methicillin sensitive MSSA, which is an equally aggressive bug and also very problematic. So some 10 years ago, over 10 years ago now, this great paper came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, came from Holland. What this showed is that if you decolonize patients who are carrying Staphylococcus aureus through chlorhexidine and through mipiricin up their nose, so bathing in chlorhexidine, that reduces the infection rate dramatically, you know, by about 60% in this paper. So a very potent way of reducing infection. And that is promoted by NICE. It's in NICE guidance. It's also promoted by the WHO, but actually, in terms of the UK, was not embedded as an intervention that in NHS practice in most trusts. So we designed an initiative. We have a number of partners, as you can see, and this is, could we work together to improve the practice in hip and knee replacement surgery? And the idea was to spread it into orthopedics and then out into other surgical specialties. So we used the Institute for Healthcare Improvement Breakthrough Series collaborative technique to see if we could introduce this into the NHS. So this is a way of introducing difficult, complex change into the NHS. We did it as part of a randomized trial. I won't bore you with the other side of this trial, but one arm was this MSSA reduction. So briefly speaking, we recruited 20 trusts to join us in this collaborative. We had a launch event, and then after that, the trust would go away locally and try and implement some of the change we were suggesting. And over the period of the whole collaborative, the hope is that they could introduce decolonization of MSSA carrying patients with the end game, if you like, of seeing if we could reduce infection rates, but critically to get the intervention introduced. And that the research question was, could we use breakthrough series collaboratives to change the NHS? So we had complex evaluation, and we're short on time. And just to sort of summarize this, so what this slide shows that it took about 9 months for our trust to sort of galvanize their improvement. We allowed 6 months actually, but it took about 9. But then we got about 70 to 80% coverage in the trust. So of the patients they were admitting for surgery, they were decolonizing them, which is a real win in terms of process for us. A sort of supplementary question, but an important one, is did this actually change clinical outcomes? Because we change practice for about 800 patients a month, which goes on, but did it change outcomes? Well, the interesting thing is it didn't, and there's a number of reasons potentially for that. One is that Maybe the infection rate, maybe we didn't pick up the infections. You know, I think Ashford and St Peter's have been fantastic in if you like, coming out today with their infection rate. I think that's the most positive step. Really need to be commended. But actually, a lot of trusts have a lower infection rate. They're reporting. So it could be that the infection rate was lower than we expected. Or it could, of course, mean that the intervention didn't work, because we did deliver the intervention to a lot of patients. And so this next slide shows you that the various techniques you can use to decolonize patients. So the top slide is that delivered by that patient, by that randomized trial we saw 10 years ago, and that's where the evidence is. Then you've got Naceptim, then you've got Octenison, which is an alternative, if you like. And in our program, almost all the trusts use that last one, and that's because we provided it free. It's also done without prescription. So they were essentially, it was an easy win. But the evidence for that is not as strong as it is for mupirocin at the top, which is where the strong evidence is. So what's come out since then is that this is data from our own trust, led by one of my colleagues, AJ Malvia. And these are patients that have MSSA carrying it before their operation. We decolonized them, and then we checked 4 weeks later whether the MSSA bug had disappeared. What this shows is there's a vast difference between the three techniques there. You'll see that sort of 10%, 8% are patients remaining infected, if you like, after treatment with mupirocin and niamycin, but over half of them still carrying the bug with octenidine, which was the favored treatment in our study. So that may be a reason why we didn't see a clinical outcome. So the change to make is then very easy. So what we've done in our trust is that we've moved to mupirocin to decolonize, and I think that hopefully would make the difference. So I'm just very grateful for all the teams involved, and particularly our sponsors who have been fantastic throughout this project.
Great. Thank you very much. And it's interesting, what seems like a very simple answer, but to actually get to it, the effort and the amount of work and collaboration that's required to do that, it's a kind of common theme, isn't it, across this as an area. It's quite time intensive. If I was to give you unlimited funds to run another Quest initiative, what would it be? What would be your dream next?
So I think that's a really great question. What we've learned from the collaborative is that you really need to have a fantastic intervention. You need to have one which is absolutely evidence-based and that you follow it to the letter. So, we made some assumptions in our study which actually weren't correct, probably, about the interchangeability of what we could use to treat patients. So what would I do? Well, I think in terms of reducing infection rates, we've got some research ideas. I think, in orthopedics, I think potentially antibiotic cements, we should be studying in great detail, particularly in higher BMI patients where they carry an awful lot of risk with infection. So that's probably where I'd do it, but we're waiting for some research answers to come out first. So the next collaborative probably won't be SSI for us, but it's a vitally important question.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're now into the kind of general question session. I can see the questions on the right. Can all the other speakers see the questions that are rolling through the chat section?
Yeah.
So you might click on chat. You may get some of it up there, but I'll start to summarize some of the themes, if I may. And I think there's a recurrent theme, isn't there, about one of the recommendations is a preventive infections task force, a clear target, involvement of royal colleges, and much better, stronger reporting. And that kind of makes huge sense, doesn't it? I know from having been a medical director, constructing a dashboard at a trust level, and Anna, you're doing, and it's got the right data on it. Helen, that citizens and patients can contribute to. And one of the questions just said, if someone's gone home, how's that data collected? Lindsay, there's another question which is around, as a perioperative practitioner, how on earth do I know if I did that shaving or I did that cleaning, whether it was a... Let's start with you, Anna. How can a trust get the leadership and the collaboration to really get that dashboard owned across the organization?
So I think the most important is if you have the backing of your trust management. It really makes the difference. It makes all the difference. And then secondly, you need buy-in from all your consultants in all your different specialities. We all need to sit together in the same room around the same table, and we need to all admit that we can do better and we should be doing better. And once you have everybody realizing that we have to do better, the talks will start. And once we started having a conversation, it was like everybody knew that we can do better. Everybody knew that there were problem areas, but nobody knew how to start the process or what to do about it. Now that we are all together in an oversight committee, with the backing of our top management from the trust, we can just go forward. We're just going to get better and better and make this whole program a success. And at the end of the day, we are doing it for our patients.
So it's in part a feeling you're being heard, and the work that you're doing is being seen and impacting on the organisation as much as the work you're doing, I guess. Yeah. So Helen, coming to you, I mean, patient-collected data very rarely permeates into a busy organisation, does it? What can we do to get the activated citizen, perhaps via their GP, perhaps via your own organisations, etc., creating much more of a conversation back into the NHS? Because you certainly hear at the moment that people are very busy and complication rates are increasing, not because people don't want them to, but because it's just hard.
I think the experience, and there is research on this, a lot of it from the States actually, that the more you actively engage patients, either individuals in their own care or the patient communities, you don't find difficulties of getting patients to want to contribute. I think the challenge is making the space or finding ways that work. So there are kind of models for patient engagement that will enable patients to contribute. And, we've sort of talked about the fact that there isn't a specific patient group for this issue. And I think if you look at, I've started working with the long COVID, people living with long COVID. That first Facebook group started with 100 people. It's now got 33,000 on it. And as a consequence of that, you're getting political attention, funding, government attention. It really is, it is driving some of that change. So I think the absence of that group, now that's very difficult. How do you create that? But I do wonder whether or not, it would be good to get a patient part of that task force to actually have a sort of subgroup around patient engagement to try and seek out people, use organisations like ours, the Patient Association and others, to find the right people that could contribute, and the patient-friendly clinicians that would be very, very, very welcome to engage, whether at primary care, secondary care, wherever. But I think having a theme would be good.
That's very good. So Lindsay, someone's asked a question about education, and again, one of the recommendations is about, education about surgical site infection being embedded in training. Have you ever been involved in teaching medical students or other trainee professionals? Do you get involved in the training side of things?
Yes, I did look after the ODP students. So I went through from sort of MVQ to diploma to degree level, and also as a team leader, I still work clinically 1 day a week, but due to COVID, I haven't been able to do that. So as a surgical first assistant as well, particularly when we're talking about shaving and surgical site infection, obviously realizing that the current practice that I was doing was incorrect through research, evidence-based practice, and then being able to provide that within my organization, lead on it and champion it, and educate people to understand what they were actually doing was incorrect, and they were actually potentially, you know, causing a potential infection for that patient. I was sort of dealing with people that said, well, it's not working, isn't the disposable razor, you know, and I'd say, well, a lot of the time it's about technique. So what they sort of look at is extended practice and extended roles. And if you're not actually taught how to do something, you shouldn't actually use anything that you've not got that education for. And I have observed people shaving people like they're mowing the grass or something like that, for analogy, and then they've been pressing down so hard on the skin that there's grooves in the patient's skin with the disposable razor. And then other instances where they've been using the old green Bic razors before we actually went, you know, to the disposable heads, where they were actually scraping the skin, or saying that actually the other razor wasn't working because it wasn't going right down to the skin. It was about understanding that that isn't what needs to happen. You know, you shouldn't be scraping the skin. That's the whole point of this. And we've since moved on from there.
So one of the questions someone's raised is, you know, we're short of staff and people are very busy, and often people are picking up tasks that they've not been used to doing. There's just a shortage, isn't there, of capability. What can we do through your organisation in terms of videos or education standards? Is there more we can do through remote learning?
There is lots of information provided by companies on the products that we're actually using in practice. Obviously, unfortunately, because of COVID, they haven't been able to come in. So we've got to be sort of creative in how we've been doing things. So there is virtual things out there, and there's also networking. People who are members of APP can contact APP. We also provide information to help them. But I think with a lot of it is it's having a multi sort of diverse team that is able to cross different barriers with the competency and the knowledge to be able to do these other roles, which you do get. ODPs in general are supposed to cover all areas, but often in practice don't, because of the way the organizational structure is. And I think that needs to be looked at as well.
Very good. So Mike, there's a lot of talk, isn't there, always from the ward to the board. You know, you're a champion in your trust. You've got a high profile. If we are going to have a board level champion, if you're going to be listened to in the quality, safety, improvement arena, etc., you know, any particular thoughts and recommendations as to how others in other trusts can get their voice heard and how you've managed to get yourself heard?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step that we took, and it's the same step that Anna's taken, is about having the balls, if you like, to own up and say, actually, I think we do have a problem. And you know, my trust, to their credit, we're really interested in that. And you know, I've got no problem at all getting airtime at very high level in our organisation about infection and about what they can do to support it. So I think getting the data, and probably the best way to do that now is through the GIRFT audits and through the HPA audits for specific surgery. And then it's about going to the board. And the other thing that I do when I'm trying to engage them is actually with patient stories. So patient videos are incredibly powerful at bringing not just board members, but also clinicians to heal. And actually they think about the real impact, because although I deal with infection every day, I actually don't hear the stories about the impact on their lives so much, because we're very dealing with the functional side. And I think so we use patient videos a lot, and you know, the patients that are generous enough to make videos really change it for us. We convince people that they've got a problem and that they can address it, and I think that's how we really should push this on.
And
Helen, I guess that's an open door, isn't it, for most patients?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mean, patient groups talk about the wisdom of patients, listening from the perspective of patients. And I think also I was kind of like compelled by rather squirming at what Lindsay was saying about, you know, using the Bic razor and so forth. You know, if patients are informed, if they're they're able to, and if they want to actively engage with, information about what should be happening to them and what shouldn't be happening, if they can be active participants in their care, but they can also, if they're seeing something that they said, well, that shouldn't be happening, should it? They can escalate, so that you're using them as the responsibility, obviously, for safe care is that of the organisation and the clinicians, but they can be there as extra eyes and ears as well. So I think a quote from me, Professor Ted Baker, who, as everyone knows, is Chief Inspector of Hospitals at CQC, he said, we won't be getting patient safety right unless we consider that patients are part of the clinical team. And I think I would invite that thinking and using their voices in the way that Mike suggests. It's very powerful.
Well said. And Anna, so one of the recommendations is the mandatory reporting of data. We can see in the report that there's huge variation across the 4 regions of the United Kingdom. There's variation across specialities, there's variation across hospitals. From your experience, do you think it's going to be should that be an easy thing to do if the instruction came from on high? And you've been, everyone's made the comment, been open and honest, fantastic, and it's driven change. Why isn't the data just mandated then?
So PHE have 3 months, so a quarterly section of mandatory submissions of data for certain procedures that you have to do, which fracture neck of femurs is one of them, and knee replacement and hip replacement. However, 3 months worth of a whole year doesn't say much to you about the bigger picture. For instance, I say to you, I eat really, really well on a Monday and a Tuesday, and I exercise for that Monday and Tuesday, but why am I still overweight? It's about 5 days. So you always have to look at something in its whole, and that's why we have started to submit continuously our data from January to December for these high-risk procedures to Public Health England. It's not easy to submit your data. It's a lot of, there is a structure, they give you the structure, and there's study days that you can attend, which is really great, and they have their support for you. If you have a problem, you can contact them, and they always have time to help you. However, it is really labor intensive, and also you're submitting the data, but you also have to look for SSI. Somebody has to report the SSI to you, or you have to go and look for it. And I think that is where the problem comes in a lot of places. If I don't look for those SSIs, if I don't go and investigate, I won't find them.
It's interesting, isn't it? With big data and machine learning, you would imagine we might have got to the stage now where, a positive swab recorded within 5 days of a surgical intervention would just be automatically uploaded. And is that something, Mike, that's round the corner, or?
Yes, I think it is. Certainly we're now working with machine learning, and that's exactly the sort of thing that we'll be doing. And some of the national audits are keyed into the HES data, the hospital episode statistics, and they're doing that sort of thing where they're at least asking the question. So I think probably within 2 or 3 years we will have a linkage where you'll automatically be asked the question, was there an infection? I think that's what we need to do. I mean, as Anna says, it's really easy not to collect this data and to have a lower infection rate. You just have to not look very hard.
And presumably, Lindsay, that'll be the day where it's kind of on the doors as you go into theatre, which is, how have you done this week compared to last week? You're on mute at the moment.
I don't think people actually look at what is actually happening with regards to data, and they're not informed about things like this, and they're not given the information of where to go, who to speak to, how to change practice, and if they can actually have an actual input in this to make that change, and where is it all coming from, and where do I start? This other thing as well is I've often asked people is, why are you doing this? you know, or what are you doing that for? And a lot of people go, because I've always done it that way. And they're not looking at the evidence that we're producing, or they're not being showing it, or they're not being guided to it to be able to change the practice and improve the incidence of surgical site infection.
So it's not just data, it's education and education and education.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask a question which is coming up on the question board here, which is something about quality of the equipment. So procurement has been an issue for a number of years, hasn't it, in the NHS, where it seemed to have become more distant from clinical practitioners and wider professionals. One of the recommendations is a greater link between procurement and evidence, and this report provides quite a lot of evidence. Let's go through. Mike, I'm going to start with you. What do we need to do to make sure that our staff across the whole pathway and the patient at home, as they're preparing for an operation, has the access to cost-effective, high-quality supplies?
I mean, I think it's about joining up procurement with the clinical teams. I've certainly within my career found myself using various bits of kit that I've never seen before and doesn't have an evidence base, and somebody has swapped it out for other areas. Much more recently, however, I mean, I think there's quite a good join up, certainly in my organisation, between procurement and the clinical teams. And we've recently introduced an antibacterial suture, which was an entirely clinical decision, and it was at the end of the day actually was pretty well effectively introduced through liaising with them. So it's the usual stuff. It's about communication, and I think that needs to work tightly. And I think with patients, and it's mentioned in the report, really, it's about giving them a voice, encouraging them to ask the questions about what are you doing for infection prevention.
Yeah. Anna, how have you influenced? Have you managed to influence procurement in your trust?
So yes, we work very closely with procurement. We have one designated procurement account manager, Nicola, and we work closely with her. So for every project to implement, say for instance, patient core temperature control, we have to evaluate all the available projects to us, and then we do a business case for the one that we agree to, and procurement takes that forward to us, to the financial committee, to basically fight for that. But we evaluate everything that's available to us and make sure we have the best clinical data to back.
And are those business case templates available as part of the GIRFT program or part of the quiz program?
So, business templates and I do them. So I fill them in and apply. So I'm happy to share them. It's not difficult. From a nurse point of view, that know nothing about finance.
Yeah, so just to say from a quiz perspective, yeah, one of the key things we did in the collaborative was we made the business case available. So we have all, we provide that, and we can easily pass it on to any trusts that are keen to get that.
So I'm just thinking of the... Yes, Hannah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we're doing in our knowledge platform for patient safety, the hub, is because it's not always easy to find this, you don't quite know what you're looking for. We'd be very, very happy to take good practice. I mean, obviously, it could go to Lindsay's organisation as well. But if we can kind of supplement it and reach out, and if you've got good practice, we're very happy to put it on there so that others can find it too.
So that's a good coming together, isn't it, Lindsay? So we've got, the evidence, the education, your own members and practitioners. We've got Helen about wider voice, we've got the quiz, we've got the GIRFT program, and here we've got industry working around some of the economic analysis, some of the evidence base, and this letter to editor in particular as well, isn't it, which is saying actually here is something that we all need to come together. So Lindsay, I'll give you a last word before I come back and bring Nick back into the discussion from a Merneke perspective. Anything you want to say about how how we share all this between us.
Can I just state, you know, with regards to the procurement, it's understanding how procurement works and understanding that they have towers, and the towers have different products in them. So there might be somebody looking at gloves, somebody looking at discarder pads, somebody looking at pencillettes, electrosurgical devices, and they might have 20 items in this area, and they will have clinical people as well there, although they might not be working currently in clinical practice. And they are looking at trying to reduce the amount of items on catalogue to NHS trusts to reduce cost and everything else. But it's about actually a bit like what Anna was saying about people being able to evaluate and use the products, because there's nothing worse than somebody changing or pulling a product out and giving you another product that isn't fit for purpose. And then it's evaluating it. So in a lot of places they have documentation that you have to prove and evaluate to state why you want a particular item or why you find that item is not, you know, fit for purpose. And I know a lot of the time they will change something and not think about the user at the end of the product and how that's being used. So in effect, and I'm sure Mike will probably understand this as a surgeon, is this something gives you an instrument that's totally different, ergonomically, weighs different and everything, it can affect your surgical performance. And they don't get it. And it's trying to explain to them and understand this. And it's not just about money. And I think to some extent procurement are looking at that. They are always cost orientated, but they are actually looking, you know, at the fact that actually, you know, we have two products there, but that one really isn't fit for purpose, even though it's cheaper, but we may have to use the more expensive one. And it's prizing safety around that. So have patients been harmed by it? And I've seen when they started looking at trocars and things where bits were breaking off the trocars, you know, in patients, you know, and they've not done proper trials on products. So there is a patient safety aspect here that they really need to be looking at, and involving clinicians that are working in practice.
So it feels to me ahead, there's this knowledge sharing, isn't there? This understanding those, as you say, the different pillars, bringing everything together. And it's interesting looking at the questions, you know, there's quite a lot of quite specific questions around length of stay, or ones just come up about diathermy and the smoke, etc. How can, you know, there's something about keeping this platform alive, isn't there, to allow those conversations. And I encourage you all as speakers to look at the questions, because I think there are some quite specific questions that have come up. So that to me feels we've reached the official end of time. Helen, I know you have to swap with Nick at this point. So can I thank you, first of all, very much from your perspective and the slides you shared. And I'm sure this is the beginning of a conversation. Well, we know the conversation's been going on throughout the report, but thank you to you in particular. I'll thank the other speakers in a minute. But
all right, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We shall pause. Just while we're waiting for Nick to come back in, let's get a last comment or observation from anyone. So let's start with you, Emma. Been a helpful discussion?
Yes, well, the best advice I can give everybody is probably to just work as a team. It's not a one-person job. It's not even a 2 or 3 person job. This really needs input from your top management to cleaning services, to matrons, consultants, procurement. Everybody needs to be involved. And that's the only way that you're going to make this a success. Your program is a good one.
So Nick, just before we come to you, I'll just ask the speakers if they had any last final comment. Lindsay, any last little observation?
I think obviously I've been looking at some of the comments, and I think there is obviously a big issue about equipment and instrumentation, particularly through COVID, putting not only staff and patients at risk, particularly around PPE, which has been constant since before March, and they're really still struggling now. We thought they were getting it right, but we're still getting questions asked about PPE and not being provided the appropriate aid to protect them.
Great. Well, we need better. Mike, last comment?
I think if people are wondering what they can do, then just read the report, and the report has a job for everybody. And if you can do that, then we'll be well on our way.
Excellent. So Nick, thank you, Domenica, for kicking all this off. I think it's been, you can see a very engaged community out there, lots of rich questions,
yep.
Excellent presentations. Over to you to kind of summarize where we are and your final observations.
Great, thank you, Steve, very much appreciate it. And thank you to all the attendees for so many questions. I think that's what really brings these types of events to life. It's not just around the content that's discussed, it's around the questions that hopefully raises, and some opportunities for further discussion. So thank you very much to everybody for attending this evening, and especially to our speakers and Dr. Feast, of course, Steve, for sharing what's been an excellent discussion. So for me to wrap up, I just wanted to raise a couple of points around 3 areas. The first is that, as discussed, you can all access the State of the Nation report in the files section on the webinar platform over to the right-hand side. So please feel free to download that and also to share it with any of your colleagues. Secondly, we've also written a Merneke letter to editor calling for urgent action to reduce SSIs, and it would be fantastic if any of you would be willing to sign this. The letter is available in the files section of the webinar platform as well, and it's our belief that with the impact of COVID-19 being felt across the whole of the NHS, it is very important that this government, as it builds back the health services better than hopefully they were before, that minimising the risk of SSIs is a central part of that government strategy. And the letter to editor calls on the government to act on behalf of everybody involved, whether that's patients, families, caregivers, to ensure that we can also act now against SSIs. Finally, Merneke is also supporting hospitals in our own way through our dedicated team of SSI specialists that we have, and our risk reduction partnership, which is a new concept and program that we've introduced. And information available on this is in the links section of the platform. But if you would prefer, you can easily contact us by email if you want to know any more information. So once again, thank you very much to our speakers and to our chair. Really appreciate your time and your efforts this evening to facilitate this discussion and all the time and preparation that you've put in. Thank you very much for everybody attending. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion and have a lovely evening. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I would just ask Rob, who I hope is in the background on the platform, how much will this platform be open for much longer for people to look at the questions?
Yes, it will. It'll stay open.
Great. So though some of us will leave, you'll have a chance to continue just browsing the files, the offers, and the questions. And thank you, everyone, and have a nice evening. And been a great session. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you,
Steve.
Bye-bye.